When assassins breached the Nightingale estate's inner courtyard, Min Jun's elite guards reached for their weapons. Alice Walsh, the maid in the blue uniform, reached for a needle. The lead assassin dropped before his finger found the trigger. The needle had entered at the C7 vertebrae, precise, surgical, irreversible. Alice caught his pistol mid-fall and used it to pistol-whip the second man. The third tried to fire. She drove a needle through his radial nerve, and his hand went dead, the gun clattering to marble tile. The rest hesitated. Fatal mistake. The courtyard, where she'd served afternoon tea and trimmed hedges for 6 months, had become an execution ground in under 2 minutes. And Min Jun, the man they'd come to kill, stood frozen beside the koi pond, his white shirt catching the last rays of sunset, dragon tattoo stark against his throat. His expression held something between shock and vindication as he watched his maid disarm their leader first, then move through the rest like death had learned to wear an apron. But let's rewind. Because the story of how a 6-foot-tall black woman with acupuncture needles hidden in her uniform pockets became the only barrier between LA's youngest crime lord and a squad of trained killers starts 6 months earlier. With a patient who died because nobody listened, and a career that ended because Alice Walsh refused to be quiet about it. 6 months earlier. Alice had always trusted the warning. Her grandmother, a healer from Louisiana who knew roots and remedies, had taught her to read the body's whispers, the way muscles tense before violence erupted, how certain silences preceded catastrophe, the electric tingle down your spine when everything was about to shatter. So when the attending physician overrode her orders in the trauma bay and Alice's spine lit up with that specific fire, she knew. She said it anyway. If you give him that dosage, he'll code in 4 minutes. Dr. Morrison didn't even look up from the chart. I don't take medical advice from nurses who think they're doctors, Walsh. Administer the medication. Alice's jaw locked. I'm telling you his kidney function. That's an order. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the patient flatlined. Alice called the code. Performed compressions for 18 minutes while Drive Morrison stood frozen. They couldn't bring him back. She filed the incident report that same night. Detailed, clinical, damning. By morning, she was called into HR. Your concerns have been noted, the director said, sliding a folder across the desk. However, Dr. Morrison is a valued member of this hospital. Your intensity has been flagged by multiple staff members. We're accepting your resignation, effective immediately. I didn't resign. You are now. Alice walked out of LA General with 5 years of trauma nursing behind her, a severance check that wouldn't cover 2 months' rent, and a reputation that made her unhireable at every hospital in the city. Too intense. Too confrontational. Too much. Her boyfriend, Daniel, lasted another 2 weeks before the same words found his mouth. You're just a lot, Alice. You look at people like you can see through them. It's unsettling. I need someone softer. She'd expected it. Heard it before. Men who wanted her height and her competence in theory but couldn't handle what it actually meant to be with a woman who took up space without apology. Who saw weakness and called it by name. Who had hands trained to heal but eyes trained to assess threats. So she said nothing. Just packed the overnight bag she'd left at his apartment and walked out with her spine straight and her heart calcified. Ended up at a staffing agency that placed domestic workers. Not her plan. Not her dream. But rent was due, her resume was blacklisted, and sometimes survival meant swallowing your pride and taking the only door that opened. I have something unusual, the recruiter said, scanning Alice's file. High-profile family. Very private. Very particular. They specifically requested someone with medical training. Someone observant. Observant meaning? Meaning they value discretion and awareness. The pay is excellent, $4,000 a week plus room and board. But you'd be living on site. And you can't ask questions about what you see. Every instinct told Alice this wasn't normal domestic work. But her bank account was screaming louder than her instincts. When do I start? Tomorrow. 6 a.m. The Nightingale Estate. Ask for Mrs. Lim. She manages the household. Alice should have researched the family. Should have asked more questions. Instead, she showed up the next morning in a borrowed uniform, her hair pulled into a tight bun, acupuncture needles tucked in her apron pocket, a habit from her TCM training she'd never broken. Mrs. Lim met her at the service entrance. Late 50s, Korean, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing. You were trauma nurse, Mrs. Lim said. Not a question. A confirmation. Yes, ma'am. Why you leave? I was too intense for them. Mrs. Lim smiled. Thin and sharp. Here, intensity is requirement, not flaw. You will serve breakfast, maintain the estate, and most importantly, you will observe. The young master values awareness. You understand? I understand that I don't understand, Alice said carefully. But I'm a fast learner. Good. He will be here in 1 hour. Never stare. Never ask questions. And never, ever show fear. Min-jun arrived exactly 60 minutes later. Alice saw him through the kitchen window first. Late 20s, moving with the controlled precision of a trained fighter, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car. But it was the tattoo that marked him, an intricate dragon that started behind his right ear and coiled down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. In her grandmother's tradition, dragons meant power. In Korean criminal hierarchy, neck tattoos meant something else entirely. He took his seat at the breakfast table, the chair positioned with clear sightlines to every entrance. Mrs. Lim nodded at Alice. Serve him. Alice carried the coffee tray with steady hands, her clinical training kicking in. Observe. Assess. Adapt. She poured his coffee. Met his eyes directly. Anything else, sir? Min-jun studied her. His gaze was sharp, assessing, the kind that made most people look away. Alice had spent 5 years staring down death in trauma bays. She didn't flinch. You're new, he said. His English was perfect, his voice low and measured. Started this morning. Mrs. Lim hired you quickly. She's usually more cautious. Maybe she saw something she liked. A ghost of a smile. And what do you see when you look at me? Alice tilted her head, considering. A man who sits where he can see all the exits. Who checks the security cameras before drinking his coffee. Who has a dragon tattoo that marks him as someone people either fear or follow. His eyes narrowed. Most domestic staff pretend not to notice. I spent 5 years in LA trauma. I learned to notice everything where people died. Old habits. Why aren't you nursing anymore? I was too observant. Apparently, that's a flaw in some environments. Not this one. Min-jun pulled out his wallet and placed $500 bills on the table. Extra. For noticing what others pretend not to see. Alice looked at the money. Then at him. Every instinct screamed that taking it meant crossing a line from employee to something else, witness, accomplice, asset. But she was already here. Already in the orbit of whatever this world was. She pocketed the bills. Discretion purchased. Though I still don't know what I'm being discreet about. You will. His eyes held hers. You're not afraid of me. Should I be? Most people are. Most people haven't spent 5 years keeping gangbangers and cops alive on the same trauma table. You'd need to be a lot more than a man in a nice suit with a dragon tattoo to scare me. Min-jun studied her for a long moment. Then he laughed. Actually laughed, low and genuine. Mrs. Lim chose well. Welcome to the Nightingale Estate, Alice Walsh. Try not to die here. Alice turned to leave, then paused. For the record, that dragon coils the wrong way for traditional Korean designs. Which means either you hired a terrible artist, or it's deliberately wrong. A signal to people who know how to read it. His smile vanished. What else do you notice? You have a small scar on your left hand. Defensive wound, maybe 2 years old. Your right shoulder sits slightly higher, old injury, probably a gunshot. And you haven't looked at your phone once since sitting down, which means you're either disciplined beyond measure or you're expecting something in person. Silence filled the room like a held breath. Then Minjun spoke, and his voice carried a weight that made the air feel thinner. Mrs. Lim. Give Alice access to the inner courtyard. I think she's going to be very useful. Before we start this journey together, go ahead and like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're reading from. It truly means a lot to me seeing this community of thriller lovers grow across the world and everywhere between. Every comment, every share helps us bring more stories like Alice and Minjun's to life, together. The first gunshot shattered the evening quiet like a fist through glass. Alice was carrying a tray of jasmine tea across the inner courtyard when the security alarm screamed to life. She'd been mid-step, her body already reading the violence in the air before her conscious mind caught up. That electric warning down her spine, her grandmother's gift, the thing that had kept her alive through 5 years of LA trauma centers. She dropped the tray. Porcelain exploded across marble tile. The east gate blew inward with a concussive boom that rattled her teeth. Smoke. Shouting in Korean. Then figures in black tactical gear poured through the breach like water through a burst dam, weapons raised, moving in practiced formation. Minjun's guards, 6 of them, trained ex-military, opened fire from their positions. But these weren't street thugs or rival gang members testing boundaries. These were professionals. The kind who moved like they'd done this 100 times. The kind who'd studied the estate's layout, the guard rotations, the blind spots. The kind who'd come to kill a king. Alice's training kicked in before thought could interfere. She'd spent 5 years in trauma bays where hesitation meant death, where you either moved with precision or you watched people die. Her hands went to her apron pockets, fingers finding the slim case of acupuncture needles she always carried, a habit from her traditional Chinese medicine training that had never made sense to anyone but her grandmother. Made sense now. The lead assassin was already through the courtyard, cutting down one of Minjun's guards with clinical efficiency. Dark suit, expensive. Face hidden behind a tactical mask. But bodies were bodies, and Alice knew them better than most people knew their own reflection. She saw the way he moved, slight favor of his left leg, old injury probably, the way his right shoulder dipped when he raised his weapon. Weaknesses written in flesh. She moved. The needle slipped between her fingers with familiar ease, her thumb finding the perfect grip. The way her acupuncture instructor had taught her, the way her grandmother had shown her with sewing needles when she was 8 years old. The due meridian ran down the spine. C7 vertebra was the pressure point the Chinese called de jui, great hammer. Hit it right, and the body's electrical system short-circuited. Hit it wrong, and nothing happened. Alice didn't hit things wrong. She closed the distance in 4 strides. Her height and athletic build letting her eat ground faster than anyone expected from a woman in a maid's uniform. The lead assassin was turning, some sixth sense warning him, but Alice was already there. Already moving. Already striking. The needle went in at the C7 vertebrae with surgical precision. He dropped like someone had cut his strings. Gun clattered. Body hit marble with a wet thunk. Alice caught his pistol mid-fall, her muscle memory from military combat medic training taking over. She'd spent 2 years with the army before nursing school, patching up soldiers in places the government pretended they'd never been. They'd taught her to shoot. Taught her to fight. Taught her that sometimes healing meant being willing to harm. She pistol-whipped the second assassin across the jaw. Felt bone crack. He went down. The third one was faster, swinging his weapon toward her, finger already squeezing the trigger. Alice drove another needle through his radial nerve with the same clinical precision she'd once used to place IVs in coding patients. His hand went dead instantly. The gun dropped. She swept his legs and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the ground. The courtyard had gone quiet except for gunfire at the perimeter and someone screaming orders in Korean. Alice stood in the center of it all, needle between her fingers, stolen pistol in her other hand, 3 bodies at her feet. Her blue uniform was splattered with blood that wasn't hers. Her white headpiece had come loose, natural hair escaping in wild coils. She counted heads. 11 more assassins flooding through the breached gate. Min Jun's remaining guards pinned down, outnumbered, outgunned. And Min Jun himself stood frozen beside the koi pond, his white shirt catching the courtyard lights, dragon tattoo stark against his throat. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shock, yes, but also something else. Recognition. Vindication. Like he'd been waiting for this moment. Like he'd known all along what she was. Alice met his eyes across 20 feet of chaos. Stay down, she said. Her voice was steady, clinical, the same tone she'd used when calling codes in the trauma bay. I'll handle this. Then she moved toward the remaining assassins like death had learned to wear an apron. 6 months earlier, Alice had still believed competence was an asset. She'd learned differently at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, standing over a patient who shouldn't have been dying. His kidney function is compromised, Alice said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chaos of the trauma bay. If you give him that dosage of morphine, his system won't process it. He'll code. Dr. Morrison didn't even look up from the chart. Just kept writing orders with the supreme confidence of a man who'd never been questioned by someone he considered beneath him. I don't take medical advice from nurses who think they're doctors, Walsh. Administer the medication. Alice's spine lit up with that warning tingle, the electric fire that meant something terrible was about to happen. Her grandmother had called it the knowing. Her mother had called it anxiety. Alice had learned over 5 years in trauma nursing to call it by its real name, certainty. I'm telling you, his labs show. That's an order, Nurse Walsh. The room had gone silent. The other nurses were staring at their feet. The resident looked uncomfortable but said nothing. And Alice stood there with a syringe in her hand and a patient's life in the balance and a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She could administer the medication and watch him die while covering her ass with, I was just following orders. Or she could refuse and lose her job. Alice had never been good at choosing self-preservation over truth. I'm documenting my objection, she said, her voice cold as a scalpel. For the record. Noted. Now do your job. She did. Because the alternative was being dragged out by security while someone else administered it anyway. At least this way she could be there when it went wrong. At least she could call the code. At least she could try. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, the monitor flatlined. Alice called it before anyone else moved. Code blue. Starting compressions. Her hands locked together, her body weight driving down into the patient's sternum with the rhythm she could do in her sleep. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Check pulse. Nothing. Again. Dr. Morrison stood frozen, his face gray, his supreme confidence cracking like cheap plaster. They worked for 18 minutes. Alice's arms burned. Sweat dripped down her spine. But the patient's heart had already decided it was done, and no amount of CPR was going to argue it back to life. Time of death. 4:05 a.m. Alice stripped off her gloves with hands that didn't shake, because she'd learned in the army not to show weakness, not to let them see you break, and walked straight to the nurse's station. Pulled up the electronic chart. Started typing her incident report with clinical precision. Patient presented with compromised kidney function. Labs showed GFR of 22, indicating stage 4 chronic kidney disease. Morphine dosage of 10 mg was contraindicated. Objection was raised and documented verbally at 3:47. Order was given to administer anyway. Patient coded at 3:51 as predicted. Cause of death, morphine overdose leading to respiratory failure in patient with severe renal impairment. She hit submit at 4:23 a.m. By 9:15 a.m., she was sitting in human resources across from a woman whose smile was made of corporate policy and legal liability. Your concerns have been noted, Ms. Walsh. The HR director slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a severance agreement. However, Dr. Morrison is a valued member of this hospital with an impeccable record. Your employment here has been marked by numerous complaints about your attitude. Confrontational. Insubordinate. Intimidating to other staff. Alice leaned back in her chair, her 6-foot frame making the office furniture feel like it was built for children. Intimidating. That's an interesting word for right. Your intensity has created a hostile work environment. A patient died because a doctor's ego was more important than his competence, and I'm the hostile one. The director's smile went thinner. More dangerous. We're accepting your resignation, effective immediately. I didn't resign. You are now. The woman tapped the severance agreement. Sign this, take your pay, and leave quietly. Or we mark you as terminated for cause, and you'll never work in another hospital in this city. Your choice. Alice looked at the paper. At the woman. At the 5 years of trauma nursing she'd poured into this place, the lives she'd saved, the nights she'd worked until her hands shook and her eyes burned. She signed. Walked out of LA General with a severance check that wouldn't cover 2 months' rent and a reputation that followed her like a shadow. Too intense. Too confrontational. Too much woman in too much space with too much competence that made men uncomfortable. Her boyfriend, be specific. See, that. That right there. He gestured at her like she was evidence in his own argument. You're just, a lot. You look at people like you can see through them. It's unsettling. And you're always so sure of yourself. So intense about everything. You mean competent. I mean scary. His voice went softer, like gentleness would make the words cut less. I need someone softer. Someone who makes me feel. I don't know. Bigger, I guess. Alice had heard variations of this speech before. From her ex-husband, who'd lasted 3 years before admitting he'd married her thinking her intensity would mellow. From the hospital administrator who'd called her aggressive for advocating for patients. From the attending who'd told her she'd never advance in nursing because she'd made people uncomfortable. Code 4, you're a 6-foot-tall black woman who takes up space without apologizing, and men don't know what to do with that. Okay, Alice said. Her voice was steady. Clinical. The same tone she used to call time of death. I'll get my things. Alice, come on. No. You're right. You need someone softer. She moved through his apartment with practiced efficiency, gathering the toiletries she'd left in his bathroom, the spare clothes in his closet, the book on her nightstand. Someone who makes you feel big by making herself small. I hope you find her. She walked out with her overnight bag and her dignity and her heart calcified just a little bit more against men who wanted her power in theory but couldn't handle it in practice. Ended up walking 12 blocks in heels she'd bought special for their anniversary dinner, the one he'd never shown up to, texting, "Can't do this anymore," while she'd sat alone at the restaurant for 43 minutes. The evening air was cool. The city lights harsh. And Alice's spine was tingling with that electric warning that meant her life was about to pivot. She ended up in Koreatown, in front of a staffing agency that placed domestic workers. Not her plan. Not her dream. But rent was due in 2 weeks, her nursing career was radioactive, and sometimes survival meant swallowing your pride and taking the only door that opened. The recruiter's name was Jenny Park, and she looked at Alice like she was trying to solve a complicated math problem. You're overqualified, Jenny said, scanning Alice's resume. Former Army combat medic. Bachelor's in nursing. 5 years trauma experience. Traditional Chinese medicine certification. Why are you here? Because I'm blacklisted from every hospital in LA for being too competent in ways that made powerful men uncomfortable. Jenny's eyebrows went up. Then she smiled, sharp and knowing. I think I have something for you. But it's unusual. Unusual how? High-profile family. Very private. Very particular. They specifically requested someone with medical training who knows how to be observant without being nosy. Someone who can handle seeing things and keeping their mouth shut. Alice's instincts were screaming. That sounds less like domestic work and more like discretion. Jenny's smile didn't waver. The pay is excellent. $4,000 a week plus room and board. Live-in position at the Nightingale Estate in Hancock Park. But you can't ask questions about what you see. And you have to start tomorrow. $4,000 a week. That was more than Alice had made nursing, and it came with housing. Her bank account was screaming louder than her instincts. What exactly would I be doing? Light housekeeping. Serving meals. General household management. And observing. Jenny leaned forward. The family values awareness. They want someone who notices things. Someone who can read a room and understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Every alarm in Alice's head was ringing. This wasn't normal domestic work. This was something else. Something that probably involved the kind of families who needed staff that could keep secrets. But she was 30 days from eviction and unemployed and too intense for normal society anyway. When do I start? Tomorrow, 6 a.m. Ask for Mrs. Lim, she manages the household. And Alice? Jenny's expression went serious. Whatever you see there, it stays there. Understood? Understood. Alice should have researched the family. Should have asked more questions. Should have listened to the warning tingle in her spine that was screaming this was more than she was signing up for. Instead, she showed up the next morning at the Nightingale Estate wearing a borrowed maid's uniform, dark blue with a crisp white apron and a ruffled white headpiece that made her feel like she'd stepped into a period drama. She'd pulled her natural hair into a tight bun, tucked her acupuncture needles into her apron pocket out of habit, and tried to look like she belonged. The Nightingale Estate was the kind of place that made you understand wealth wasn't just money, it was power made visible. 10-foot walls. Security cameras at every angle. A gate that required 3 forms of authorization. The house itself was modernist architecture mixed with traditional Korean design, all clean lines and natural materials that probably cost more per square foot than most people's entire homes. Mrs. Lim met her at the service entrance. Late 50s, Korean, with iron gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything twice and been unimpressed both times. You are Alice Walsh. Not a question. A confirmation. Yes, ma'am. You were trauma nurse. Army before that. Traditional Chinese medicine training. Mrs. Lim's eyes were scanning Alice like a CAT scan, seeing everything. Why you leave nursing? I was too intense for them. Too willing to question doctors who were wrong. Something flickered in Mrs. Lim's expression. Approval, maybe. Here, intensity is requirement, not flaw. You will serve breakfast, maintain the estate, and most importantly, you will observe. Observe what? Everything. The young master values awareness. He needs people around him who can see what others miss. Mrs. Lim's gaze sharpened. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand that I don't fully understand yet. But I'm a fast learner. Good. Mrs. Lim's smile was thin as a knife blade. He will be here in 1 hour. 3 rules: never stare unless he addresses you directly. Never ask questions about his business. And never, ever show fear. You show fear, and you're useless to him. Alice's spine tingled. What exactly does he do? That is question you don't ask. Mrs. Lim turned toward the kitchen. Come. I show you the estate. You learn fast, or you leave. The next hour was a whirlwind of instructions. How Min Jun liked his coffee, black, no sugar, exactly 185 degrees. Where to stand when serving, never blocking his sightline to the doors. What rooms were off limits, the entire east wing and the basement level. What to do if certain guests arrived. Serve them, observe them, report anything unusual to Mrs. Lim immediately. By the time the security system chimed announcing Min Jun's arrival, Alice's head was spinning with protocols that felt less like household management and more like military briefings. She saw him through the kitchen window first. Late 20s. Moving with the controlled grace of an apex predator, the kind of body control that came from years of martial arts training, every step deliberate, every movement economical. He wore a charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked like it had been built around him rather than purchased. Black hair styled sharp. Features that were striking in a way that made you look twice, high cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes that saw everything. But it was the tattoo that marked him. An intricate dragon that started behind his right ear, coiling down his neck in black ink, disappearing beneath his collar. In traditional Korean design, dragons coiled a certain way. This one didn't. It coiled the opposite direction, deliberately wrong, deliberately visible. A declaration. A warning. In her grandmother's tradition, dragons meant power and protection. In Korean organized crime, neck tattoos meant something else entirely, rank, loyalty, blood. Alice's instincts crystallized into certainty. She was working for a criminal. Mrs. Lim appeared beside her. Serve him now. Don't stare. Don't show fear. Alice picked up the coffee service with steady hands. Because if 5 years of trauma nursing had taught her anything, it was how to keep your hands steady when everything inside you was screaming. Min Jun took his seat at the breakfast table, a position with clear sight lines to every entrance, his back to the wall, the kind of seating choice that said he'd learned the hard way to always know where threats could come from. Alice walked over, her spine straight, her clinical training kicking in. Observe. Assess. Adapt. She'd dealt with powerful men before, doctors who thought their degrees made them gods, administrators who wielded policy like weapons, colonels who could order men to their deaths with a signature. She'd learned early that the only way to survive them was to never show fear. She poured his coffee with practiced precision. Met his eyes directly. Anything else, sir? Min Jun studied her. His gaze was sharp, assessing, the kind that made most people look away and mumble. Alice had spent 5 years staring down death in trauma bays while calling rapid responses and coding patients. She didn't flinch. You're new, he said. His English was perfect, unaccented, his voice low and measured, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to command attention. Started this morning. Mrs. Lim hired you quickly. She's usually more cautious. His eyes didn't leave hers. What makes you special? I notice things. And I know how to keep my mouth shut about what I notice. The corner of his mouth twitched. Almost a smile. What do you notice right now? Alice tilted her head, considering. Medical assessment was her native language. You're sitting where you can see all the exits. You checked the security camera feeds on your phone before you sat down. I saw the reflection in the window. You have a dragon tattoo that coils the wrong way for traditional Korean designs, which means it's deliberately sending a message to people who know how to read it. And your right shoulder sits slightly higher than your left, old injury, probably a gunshot based on the way you compensate when you move. Silence filled the dining room like a held breath. Mrs. Lim had gone very still. Min Jun's expression was unreadable. Then slowly, deliberately, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that should have been warming but instead made Alice's instincts scream because she recognized it, the smile of a predator that had just spotted something interesting. Mrs. Lim chose well, he said quietly. Then he pulled out his wallet and placed $500 bills on the table. Extra compensation. For noticing what others pretend not to see. Alice looked at the money. Then at him. Every instinct screamed that taking it meant crossing a line. From employee to asset, from staff to accomplice. But she was already here. Already in the orbit of whatever this world was. She pocketed the bills. Discretion purchased. Though I still don't know exactly what I'm being discreet about. You will. His eyes held hers. You're not afraid of me. Should I be? Most people are. Most people haven't spent 5 years keeping gangbangers and cops alive on the same trauma table. You'd need to be a lot more than a man in a nice suit with a dragon tattoo to scare me. Min-jun laughed. Actually laughed, low and genuine, like he'd just heard something surprising. Welcome to the Nightingale Estate, Alice Walsh. Try not to die here. The consultation started 3 weeks later. Alice had settled into the rhythm of the estate, mornings serving breakfast, afternoons maintaining the house, evenings preparing dinner and cleaning. Simple work. Mindless work. The kind that let her brain run on autopilot while her instincts stayed sharp and observed everything. She noticed the guests who came and went. The men in expensive suits who spoke in rapid Korean and never smiled. The women with designer handbags and hard eyes who carried themselves like they knew how to use the guns probably holstered at their backs. The way Mrs. Lim treated certain visitors with elaborate courtesy and others with barely concealed disdain. She noticed the security rotations. The blind spots in the camera coverage. The panic buttons hidden under tables and behind bookshelves. The reinforced steel core in the wooden front door. She noticed that Min-jun watched her watching everything, and he never told her to stop. It was a Thursday evening when he called her into his study. The room was all dark wood and leather, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes in Korean and English, a massive desk positioned, of course, where he could see every approach. "Close the door," he said. Alice did, her spine tingling with that warning electric. Not danger exactly. Change. Min-jun gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit. Please. She sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, the posture her mother had drilled into her about how to take up space without apologizing for it. "I have a proposition for you," Min-jun said. "You've been here 3 weeks. In that time, you've proven yourself observant, discreet, and unafraid. Those qualities are valuable to me. I'm listening. I host meetings here. Business negotiations. Some of my associates bring guests. I need someone who can observe those guests and tell me what they're really thinking. What they're hiding. Whether they're lying." Alice kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. "You want me to profile people. I want you to read them. You have training in medicine, combat, human behavior. You notice things others miss." He leaned forward slightly. "I'll pay you $5,000 per consultation. Cash. All you have to do is be present during the meeting, observe, and report your assessment to me afterward. $5,000. For doing what her instincts did automatically anyway. And if I say no? Then you continue as my housekeeper at your current salary, and we never speak of this again. No pressure. No consequences." His eyes held hers. "But I don't think you'll say no. Because I've been watching you too, Alice Walsh. You're bored with housework. Your mind is too sharp to spend it dusting furniture." He wasn't wrong. Alice had spent 3 weeks feeling like a thoroughbred forced to pull a cart, capable of so much more than what she was doing, her instincts and training going to waste on menial tasks. What kinds of meetings? Business negotiations mostly. Territory discussions. Partnership proposals. Some of them are straightforward. Others involve people who would smile while planning to stab me in the back. Min-jun's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing weather patterns. I need to know which is which. And if I assess that someone's lying, planning to betray you, what happens to them? That's not your concern. Your job is observation and reporting. Nothing more. Alice studied him. This was the line, the clear, bright line between domestic worker and accomplice to whatever illegal empire Min Jun ran. Cross it, and there was no going back to pretending she didn't know what this household really was. But she'd already crossed that line the moment she took the job. The moment she pocketed that first $500 and agreed to be discreet about what she saw. I want the first payment up front, Alice said. Before the consultation. Min Jun smiled. Pulled open his desk drawer and took out a thick envelope. Slid it across the polished wood. The first meeting is tomorrow night. 8 p.m. Wear your uniform. Stand by the bar. Observe. Report afterward. Alice took the envelope. Felt the weight of it. $5,000 in cash. More than she'd made in a month of trauma nursing. One more condition, she said. Name it. I report only to you. Not Mrs. Lim, not your security, not anyone else. Just you. His expression shifted into something that might have been respect. Agreed. Welcome to the inner circle, Alice. That night, alone in her small room on the estate's third floor, Alice counted the money. 50 $100 bills. Clean, crisp, real. She thought about her grandmother, who'd taught her to read signs and trust her instincts. About her mother, who'd raised her to take up space without apology. About the career she'd lost because she'd been too intense, too competent, too much woman for a world that wanted her smaller. And she thought about Min Jun's words. Your mind is too sharp to waste on dusting furniture. For the first time in months, Alice felt like she was being used for what she was actually good at. Seen for what she actually was. Dangerous? Probably. Illegal? Definitely. But as she tucked the envelope into her locked drawer and lay back on her narrow bed, Alice realized her spine wasn't tingling with warning anymore. It was tingling with purpose. The consultations became routine over the next 3 months. Alice would stand by the bar in her blue uniform, invisible as wallpaper, while Min Jun hosted meetings with men who spoke in careful euphemisms about territory adjustments and revenue streams. She'd watch body language, listen to tone shifts, note who touched their faces when answering questions, all the tells her medical training had taught her to read in patients who lied about their symptoms. Afterward, she'd report to Min Jun in his study. The man in the gray suit touched his ear 3 times when discussing the shipment timeline. He's lying about the dates. The woman with the red lipstick kept glancing at the door. She's planning an exit strategy. Your business partner's pulse was visible in his neck when you mentioned expansion into Long Beach. He's already moving on it without your approval. Min Jun would listen, his expression unreadable, and then thank her. The envelope would appear on her dresser the next morning. $5,000 every time. Alice had $50,000 in cash hidden in her room by the time everything changed. It was a Friday night. Late autumn, the kind of evening where LA pretended it had seasons. Min Jun was hosting a negotiation with representatives from a rival organization, the Lee family. Mrs. Lim had whispered with unusual tension. Old school Korean mob. Ruthless. Territorial. The kind of people who didn't like that Min Jun was young and ambitious and cutting into their profits. Alice stood by the bar as usual, pouring drinks when requested, otherwise a piece of furniture with eyes. There were 4 Lee family representatives. 3 men, 1 woman. The oldest man, late 50s, silver-haired, expensive suit, was clearly the decision-maker. The others were enforcers. One of them, mid-30s with slick back hair and a smile like broken glass, kept looking at Alice. Not the way men usually looked at her. This was assessment. Calculation. The meeting was tense but civil. Territory discussions. Percentage splits. The kind of negotiation where everyone spoke in metaphors because saying the actual illegal things out loud gave lawyers ammunition. Alice was refilling water glasses when the man with the broken glass smile stood up, blocking her path. "You're a pretty thing to have serving drinks," he said in English, his accent thick. "Seems like a waste of talent." Alice's spine tingled. "Warning. Excuse me." She tried to step around him. He grabbed her wrist. Not hard. Not violent. Just enough to stop her. Just enough to establish control. The kind of grab that said, "I can touch you and you can't do anything about it." Alice's training kicked in before thought could interfere. 5 years in trauma centers where she dealt with aggressive patients, combative drunks, abusive partners who tried to follow victims into the ER. 2 years in the army where they taught her that sometimes the only way to establish a boundary was to enforce it with force. Her free hand moved to her apron pocket. Fingers found a needle. She drove it into the pressure point on his radial nerve with surgical precision. The same spot that controlled hand function, the same nerve cluster she'd used on the assassin in the courtyard months from now. His hand went dead instantly. Fingers released. He staggered back, his face going from smug to shocked to furious in the span of a heartbeat. "What the?" "You grabbed me," Alice said, her voice clinical and cold. "I corrected the situation. Don't do it again." The room had gone silent. The silver-haired Lee representative was staring at Alice like he was recalculating everything he thought he knew. The woman looked impressed. The other enforcers had their hands moving toward concealed weapons. And Min-jun's expression was utterly calm, but Alice saw the tension in his shoulders, the slight shift in his posture that meant he was ready to move. "My apologies," Min-jun said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. "Alice doesn't tolerate being touched without permission." "I should have warned you." The man with the dead hand was cradling it, glaring at Alice with pure hatred. "What did you do to me?" "Temporary radial nerve compression. Function should return in about 20 minutes. Next time, ask before touching." Alice set down the water pitcher with steady hands. "Will there be anything else, sir?" She directed the question at Min-jun, whose eyes held something that might have been pride or amusement or both. "No, thank you, Alice. That will be all." She walked out of the room with her spine straight and her heart hammering and the absolute certainty that she'd just made herself visible to people who would have preferred she stay invisible. Later that night, Min-jun called her to his study. "You just alerted every criminal organization in LA that I have a maid who can drop a trained enforcer without breaking a sweat," he said. His tone was neutral, impossible to read. "He grabbed me." "I know. And you had every right to defend yourself." Min-jun leaned back in his chair, studying her. "But now you're not invisible anymore. The Lee family knows you exist. They'll research you. Figure out your background. Realize that I've placed a former army combat medic with martial arts training in my household." Alice's stomach went cold. "What does that mean?" "It means you're no longer safe operating in the shadows. You're a known variable now. And known variables become targets. I can handle myself. I know you can. I've known what you were since the day Mrs. Lim hired you." Min-jun's smile was slight, knowing. "Did you really think I needed a housekeeper? I have staff for that. I hired you because I recognized what you were the moment I saw your resume. A weapon trying to pretend she was a broom." The words hit Alice like a physical blow. "You knew. I've been in this world my entire life, Alice. I know how to spot someone trained to kill who's trying very hard not to be. The question was whether you'd remember what you were when it mattered." He stood, walked around the desk. "Tonight you remembered. Which means we need to adjust your position in this household." "Adjust how?" "You're moving into the penthouse level. My private quarters. Higher security. And you're no longer working as a consultant." He met her eyes. "You're working as my personal security." Full-time. 50,000 a month, cash. Alice's mind was reeling. I'm not a bodyguard. You're exactly a bodyguard. You're just one nobody expects. Which makes you the most effective kind. Min Jun's expression was serious now, all business. The Lee family won't let tonight go. They'll see you as a message, that I'm escalating. They'll respond. I need you close when they do. Every rational part of Alice's brain screamed that this was too far, too deep, too dangerous. But the part of her that had been suppressing her intensity for years, trying to be smaller and softer and less scary, that part was finally being told she was exactly enough. When do I move? Tonight. Mrs. Lim is already packing your things. The assassination attempt came 2 weeks later on a Wednesday afternoon. Alice was returning from a supply run, walking the 3 blocks from the Korean market to the estate with bags of groceries. Routine errand. Daylight. Crowded street. Her spine tingled half a second before the van door slid open. She dropped the groceries and moved, pure instinct. 2 men jumping out, reaching for her. Alice drove her elbow into the first one's solar plexus, used his momentum to throw him into the second. A third man coming from behind, she heard his footsteps, pivoted, drove a needle into his thigh. Femoral nerve. He went down screaming. Gunshots. Shattering glass. People running. Alice ran too, not away but toward the estate, toward safety, her medical training screaming that 3 attackers in broad daylight meant this was a message, not a serious attempt. Real assassins didn't try to grab you off the street in Hancock Park at 2 p.m. This was reconnaissance. Testing her responses. Seeing what she could do. She made it back to the estate with a split lip and skinned knuckles and fury burning in her chest. Min Jun was waiting in the foyer, his face carved from stone, 3 of his security team flanking him. Inside. Now. He didn't speak again until they were in his penthouse suite, the door locked, security protocols activated. They came for you in daylight, Min Jun said, his voice tightly controlled. That's a declaration. They're saying you're not protected by the same rules that protect me. Alice's hands were shaking now, adrenaline crash hitting hard. I handled it. You shouldn't have to. He was pacing, something Alice had never seen him do. Min Jun was always controlled, always measured. This was different. This was fury barely contained. They put you at risk to send me a message. That's the world you live in. It's the world we live in now. He stopped in front of her, his eyes intense. You're not just an employee anymore, Alice. You haven't been for months. You're. He stopped. Breathed. Started again. You're important to me. More important than I intended when I hired you. And that makes you vulnerable in ways I can't accept. Alice's heart was pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the attack. What are you saying? I'm saying that I don't want an employee. I don't want a bodyguard. I want, Min Jun's jaw tightened. I want a partner. Someone who stands beside me, not behind me. Someone who sees this world for what it is and chooses to stay anyway. The words hung in the air between them like a held breath. That's not a job offer, Alice said quietly. No. It's not. His eyes held hers. It's something else entirely. Alice should have said no. Should have walked away from the criminal and his dangerous world and his impossible proposal. Should have gone back to trying to be normal, trying to be less, trying to fit into spaces that were never built for women like her. Instead, she said, I'm tired of being too much for people who are too small. If you're offering me a place where I can be exactly what I am. Then I'm staying. Min Jun's smile was slow and genuine and more dangerous than any weapon. Good. Because I'm ending this war. And I need you with me when I do. The final negotiation was set for neutral ground, a warehouse in downtown LA that both organizations used for high-stakes meetings. The Lee family had requested it. A chance to settle the territorial disputes peacefully, they said. To avoid further bloodshed. Min Jun's security chief advised against it. Too exposed. Too many variables. Too convenient. But Min Jun agreed anyway. Because sometimes the only way to end a war was to walk into the trap and spring it on your own terms. Alice went with him. 6 months ago, she'd been a blacklisted nurse trying to disappear into domestic work. Now she was walking into a warehouse full of armed criminals wearing her blue uniform with needles in her pockets and a pistol holstered at her back. The warehouse was exactly what she expected: open floor plan, metal beams, terrible acoustics. 2 entrances, both covered by Lee family guards. 15 of their people. Min Jun had brought 8, including Alice. The negotiations started civil enough. Territory divisions. Profit sharing. The usual dance of criminal diplomacy. Alice stood behind Min Jun's chair, watching everything. Reading body language. Counting exits. Her spine was tingling with that electric warning: something was wrong, something was coming, something was about to break. She saw it in the way the Lee family's second-in-command kept glancing at his watch. The way their enforcer near the door had positioned himself for a clear shot at Min Jun. The way the woman negotiator's pupils were dilated: adrenaline, anticipation. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an execution dressed up as peace talks. Alice leaned down, whispered in Min Jun's ear. "It's a trap. 3 minutes, maybe less." His expression didn't change. Just the slightest nod. Then the silver-haired Lee representative smiled, and Alice knew time was up. "We've heard your proposal, Min Jun SSI. And we've decided to decline." His smile widened. "You're young. Ambitious. But you've forgotten the old ways. Forgotten that respect must be earned in blood." He stood. Snapped his fingers. Every Lee family member in the warehouse pulled weapons simultaneously. Not pointing yet. Just showing. Min Jun didn't move. "This is how you conduct business. Under the pretense of negotiation. This is how we remind upstarts of their place." The old man's voice was cold. "You have 2 choices. Abdicate your territory to us peacefully, or we end this now." Alice's training was screaming. 15 armed hostiles. 8 friendlies. Terrible odds. No cover. 1 exit potentially clear, but they'd never make it. Then the woman negotiator reached into her jacket and pulled out something that made Alice's blood run cold. A detonator. Dead man's switch. Thumb on the trigger. "Actually," the woman said, her voice eerily calm, "you have no choices. This warehouse is wired with enough C4 to level the entire block. We walk out. You don't." And the upstart crime lord who thought he could challenge the Lee family becomes a cautionary tale. Silence. Absolute. Terrible. Min Jun's security chief reached for his weapon. 3 Lee family guns swung toward him. "Don't," Min Jun said quietly. To his own people. Not the enemy. Smart. The woman's thumb twitched on the detonator. Now, everyone puts their weapons on the ground. Slowly. This was it. The moment. The choice. Alice had spent her entire life being told she was too much. Too intense. Too aggressive. Too willing to act when others hesitated. It had cost her her career, her relationships, her chance at normal. But normal women didn't survive moments like this. She moved. Not toward the woman with the detonator. Toward the enforcer 3 feet to the woman's left, the one who'd grabbed Alice's wrist weeks ago, whose radial nerve she'd compressed, who'd been looking for revenge ever since. He saw her coming. Started to raise his weapon. Alice was faster. The needle went into his brachial plexus. The nerve cluster in the shoulder that controlled arm function. His entire arm went dead. Gun dropped. She caught it mid-fall, spun, and in the same fluid motion drove another needle into the woman's radial nerve. The woman's hand spasmed. Thumb came off the detonator. Alice caught the device mid-air with her free hand. The warehouse erupted into chaos, shouting, weapons raising, someone screaming in Korean. But Alice was already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way she'd learned in trauma bays where seconds meant the difference between life and death. She pointed the captured pistol at the ceiling and fired once. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Everyone froze. "Nobody move," Alice said, her voice clinical and cold as a scalpel. "I'm holding the detonator. My thumb is on the trigger. Anyone shoots, my hand spasms, and we all die together." She wasn't bluffing. Her thumb was pressed against the trigger mechanism, her grip deliberate. One bullet, one death grip reflex, and the warehouse became a crater. The silver-haired Lee representative was staring at her like she was a nightmare made flesh. "You're insane. I'm a trauma nurse who spent 5 years watching people die because of negligence and violence and men who thought they were smarter than everyone else." Alice's voice didn't waver. "I've had a really long 6 months. So here's what's going to happen." She looked at Min-jun. He was watching her with absolute trust, absolute certainty. Like he'd known this moment was coming. Like he'd hired her specifically for it. "You're going to negotiate in good faith," Alice continued, her eyes back on the Lee family. "Real negotiation. Fair terms. Because if you don't, I drop this detonator and nobody wins. Not you, not us, not anyone. You'll die too," the woman with the dead hand said. "I've been dying slowly for years, trying to be small enough for a world that wants me invisible. At least this way, I go out on my own terms." Alice's smile was sharp as broken glass. "But I'd rather live. So let's all choose life. What do you say?" The warehouse stayed frozen. 15 Lee family members with weapons. 8 of Min-jun's people. One woman in a maid's uniform holding a detonator and a gun, and the entire room hostage with nothing but nerve and precision and the absolute refusal to back down. Finally, the silver-haired representative spoke. "What are your terms?" "Not mine. His." Alice nodded at Min-jun. "You came here to negotiate. So negotiate." The deal took 4 hours to hammer out. Territory splits. Profit sharing. Non-aggression pacts. All while Alice stood with the detonator and her thumb on the trigger and her spine straight and her hands steady. When it was done, when both sides had agreed, when lawyers had been called to draw up contracts, the silver-haired Lee representative looked at Alice with something between respect and fear. "You're wasted as a maid." "I know," Alice said. "That's why I quit." She handed the detonator to Min-jun's bomb tech. Carefully, professionally, like she was passing off a patient chart instead of an explosive device. Then she walked out of that warehouse with Min-jun beside her, his hand at her back, and the absolute certainty that she'd finally found the place where being too much was exactly enough. 6 months later, Alice stood in the Nightingale Estate's courtyard. The same courtyard where assassins had breached the gates and she dropped their leader first, realizing she could never go back to pretending to be less than she was. But the courtyard looked different now. The walls had been repainted. The security cameras were less obvious but more sophisticated. And there were kids playing basketball on a court Min-jun had installed last month. The Nightingale Foundation, they called it. Community programs for at-risk youth in Koreatown. After-school tutoring. Job training. Mentorship. All funded by what Min-jun called restructured revenue streams, and what Alice called money laundering ourselves legitimate. It was slow. Complicated. The kind of transformation that took years, not months. But Min-jun had meant what he said about wanting a partner. Someone who could help him build something better than the empire he'd inherited. Alice ran the Foundation's medical outreach program. Free health clinics. Addiction counseling. Everything she'd wanted to do as a nurse but couldn't because hospitals cared more about liability than lives. She was good at it. Great at it, even. And nobody told her she was too intense when she advocated for patients or pushed back against negligent care or used her scary competence to save lives. Min-jun found her in the courtyard as the sun set over LA, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The city council approved our expansion proposal, he said, coming to stand beside her. 3 more clinics. Full funding. Congratulations. You're officially a philanthropist. Alice's smile was genuine. Your crime lord ancestors are rolling in their graves. Good. Let them roll. He took her hand, the gesture still new enough to make her heart skip. 6 months of being partners in every sense of the word, and she still wasn't used to being wanted for everything she was instead of in spite of it. You know what Mrs. Lim said to me this morning? Alice asked. What? She said I'm exactly the right amount of intense. Not too much. Not too little. Just enough. Alice looked at the kids playing basketball, at the community center they'd built, at the life she'd somehow fallen into by being too competent for normal society. I've spent my whole life being told I was too much. And now I'm here, and I'm exactly enough. You were always enough, Min-jun said quietly. The world was just too small. Alice leaned into him, this man who'd hired her knowing she was a weapon and given her space to be one, who'd walked into a suicide bombing with her and trusted her to save them, who was building something legitimate because she'd asked him to try. Think we can pull this off? She asked. The whole reformed criminal empire thing. We held a room full of assassins hostage with nothing but needles and nerve. Compared to that, running a non-profit is easy. Alice laughed. Real and unguarded and happy in a way she hadn't been in years. Fair point. The basketball game was winding down. The kids were heading home, calling out goodbyes to the counselors. Normal kids in a normal program, having no idea that the foundation keeping them safe was run by a former crime lord and his partner who'd once stopped an execution with a detonator and a death grip. You ever miss it? Min-jun asked. Being a nurse. Every day, Alice admitted. But I'm healing more people now than I ever did in a trauma bay. Just differently. And the intensity? Still there. Just finally being used for something that matters. She squeezed his hand. Thank you. For seeing what I was. For not asking me to be smaller. Thank you for being too much to ignore. Min-jun's smile was soft, genuine. I hired you to be a weapon. You became so much more. Partner? Partner, he confirmed. Then, quieter, everything. The sun finished setting. The courtyard lights came on. And Alice Walsh, former combat medic, former trauma nurse, former maid, current partner in a criminal empire turned community foundation, stood in a place where her intensity was exactly right and thought about how sometimes the only way to find where you belong is to refuse to be anything other than what you are. Too much for small spaces. Just enough for the right ones. Finally enough.